Title reads Warmed in the Sunlight of Love, The Marriage of Ulysses and Julia Grant. Park ranger seated in a library, a long bookshelf and a light tan door in the background.
Hello there. This is Nick Sacco, Park Ranger at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site here in St. Louis, Missouri. And it's my pleasure today to offer this presentation about the marriage of Ulysses and Julia Grant. This is a subject that is of great interest to visitors who come to this park, learning not just about Ulysses S. Grant's personal life, but his relationship with his wife and children as well. So why don't we go ahead and get started with this presentation?
A two-story frame house.
Now, as mentioned, Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site is managed by the National Park Service here in South St. Louis County. Our primary purpose is managing the greenhouse that you see in this picture, Whitehaven. Whitehaven was the childhood home of Julia Dent Grant, and a big part of our mission is telling the story of Ulysses and Julia's early love story, their early courtship, which took place right here at the Whitehaven estate. We offer daily tours of the Grant family's home, Whitehaven. We also have a 22-minute orientation film and a museum that visitors can check out as well. So plenty of things to see and do at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site.
Two books, The Memoirs of Julia Dent Grant and The Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant.
Now, historians who study Ulysses and Julia Grant have benefited from a number of different primary source documents, but the two most important documents come from the pens of Ulysses and Julia Grant themselves. Now, of course, with Ulysses S. Grant, his famous personal memoirs written during the last year of his life in 1885, General Grant's memoirs largely revolve around his experiences in the Mexican-American War and the American Civil War, but Grant himself does talk a little bit about his personal life in the memoirs. Nevertheless, Grant's memoirs are still in print today. They've never been out of print. One of the best-selling memoirs ever written by a former president. Now, Julia Dent Grant, her story is a little more complicated. In the 1890s, years after her husband passed away, Julia began kicking around the idea of telling her own story and sharing her own experiences in life. She began working with her oldest son, Frederick Dent Grant, and Fred Grant would begin transcribing reflections that Julia would share about her life. Now, at the time, Julia wanted the same sort of money for her memoirs that her husband had received. So she's sort of making this pitch to various publishers to have the memoirs published, and nobody really took a bite at that offer because Julia was asking for near $150,000, $200,000. The first check to the Grant family for General Grant's memoirs was for $200,000. Publishers are not crazy about paying that sort of money for Julia's memoirs. So when Julia Grant died in 1902, the memoirs remained unpublished. Fast forward into the 1970s, the director of the Ulysses S. Grant Association, Dr. John Y. Simon, is going to work with the Grant family. Dr. Simon oversaw the publication of more than 30 volumes of Ulysses S. Grant's letters and papers, and he's going to work with the Grant family, who will hand over the original manuscript to Dr. Simon. And in 1975, Julia's memoirs are posthumously published. So for scholars, we're very fortunate for Julia's memoirs. They help shed insights into her own life, and perhaps most importantly, they're the very first personal memoir written by a first lady. So a rather unique place in history for Julia Grant in writing her personal memoirs.
Images of a younger Ulysses and Julia Grant.
Now, Ulysses S. Grant, of course, he's not originally from St. Louis. He was born and raised in Ohio and attended college at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. But when he graduated from West Point, his first assignment with the U.S. Army will be at Jefferson Barracks here in St. Louis, about 5 miles south of the Whitehaven estate. So Grant, he soon found himself a regular visitor at Whitehaven. He was invited to come out and visit the Dent family, and one of his best friends at West Point had been a fellow cadet named Frederick Dent. So here is what Grant says in his own personal memoirs about these early visits to Whitehaven and eventually meeting Julia Dent at this house. Here's what Grant says. He says, quote, "I soon found my way out to Whitehaven, the name of the Dent estate. As I found the family congenial, my visits became frequent. There was an older daughter of 17, Julia, who had been spending several years at boarding school in St. Louis, but who had not yet returned home. She was spending the winter in the city with connections, the family of Colonel John O'Fallon, well known in St. Louis. In February 1844, she returned to her country home. After that, I do not know, but my visits became more frequent. They certainly did become more enjoyable. We would often take walks or go on horseback to visit the neighbors until I became quite well acquainted in that vicinity. If the 4th U.S. Infantry had remained at Jefferson Barracks, it is possible, even probable, that this life might have continued for some years without my finding out that there was anything serious the matter with me." So Grant basically says here that he falls in love with Julia. The two begin a courtship, and in fact, before Grant is ordered further south to begin preparations for potential war with Mexico, Ulysses actually proposes marriage to Julia on the front porch of the Whitehaven estate.
Illustration of a Mexican-American War battle from the perspective of U.S. troops.
Now, the courtship between Ulysses and Julia Grant only lasted for about 3 months, when Grant is going to leave with the U.S. infantry, leaving St. Louis in May of 1844. Little did Grant know at the time, but he would be separated from Julia for almost 4 straight years during this time. Between 1844 and 1848, Grant was stationed at various military posts in Louisiana and Texas, and eventually played a role in fighting in the Mexican-American War. There was only one brief trip in 1845 when Grant got a leave of absence to come back to St. Louis, and at that time in 1845, he will approach Julia's father, Frederick Dent Sr., and request permission to eventually marry Julia Grant. For historians, during this long separation between Ulysses and Julia, we are very fortunate that there are a good number of letters that still exist as documentary evidence. For Ulysses, he will frequently write back to Julia at Whitehaven, reporting on conditions in the South, reporting on what's happening in the Mexican-American War as the 4th U.S. Infantry eventually makes its way to Mexico. I would like to quote some of my favorite passages from these letters. For example, in his first letter to Julia in the summer of 1844, Grant mentions that he says, quote, "Julia, I cannot express the regrets that I feel at having to leave Jefferson Barracks at the time that I did. I was just learning to enjoy the place and the society of St. Louis." And he goes on to mention that he felt like he was very well suited for the St. Louis climate. And for those of you who've lived long enough in St. Louis to know about the St. Louis climate, you know that's a pretty funny statement because it's a pretty miserable climate a lot of the time. So you know Ulysses is in love when he's talking about how much he loves the St. Louis weather. Some other letters from Ulysses. He wrote to Julia in August of 1844. He said, quote, "You say, Julia, that you often dream of me. Do tell me some of your good ones. Don't tell me any of the bad ones. To think that while I am writing this letter, the ring I used to wear is on your hand. Parting with that ring, Julia, was the strongest evidence I could have given you of the depth and sincerity of my love for you." In 1845, Grant goes on to say, quote, "I shall always look back to my short visit to Missouri as the most pleasant part of my life. In fact, it seems more like a pleasant dream than reality. I can scarcely convince myself of the fact that I was there so short a time ago." Another letter from 1845. Ulysses says, quote, "You know how awkwardly I made known to you the first time of my love. It is a scene that I often think of, and with how much pleasure did I hear that my offer was not entirely unacceptable. In going away now, I feel as if I have someone else than myself to live and strive to do well for. You can have but little idea of the influence you have over me, Julia, even while so far away." So there's really some very touching moments here where Ulysses really puts it all on the line and states his love for Julia repeatedly.
On the left, a two-story townhouse. On the right, a white wedding dress.
Now, the Mexican-American War comes to an end in 1848. The United States defeats Mexico and acquires a large amount of territory that had been previously considered part of northern Mexico. And this area will will eventually become the states of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and others that eventually become the western part of the United States. For Grant, with the end of the war, he will come back to St. Louis. He gets a leave of absence from the U.S. Army, and he will be wed to Julia Dent on August 22nd, 1848. Now, this wedding did not take place at Whitehaven. The Dent family also owned a city home at the intersection of 4th and Sear Streets in downtown St. Louis. The wedding was, by all accounts, a lovely affair. There were many people from Jefferson Barracks who came to attend the wedding. Sometimes it's inaccurately stated that future Confederate General James Longstreet was Grant's best man at the wedding. While that's not true, Longstreet and his wife did attend the wedding. And interestingly enough, a few years ago, one of our former park guides, who is now a volunteer, Chris Sneeringer, recreated the dress that Julia wore on her wedding day on August 22nd, 1848. So this is a really nice piece, a really nice artifact that volunteer Chris made for us. We put it on display in 2018 to note the 170th anniversary of the wedding, and we still put that dress out on display sometimes in August to commemorate the anniversary of this wedding. Now, this was a Methodist wedding. The Reverend John H. Lind presided over the wedding, and he was at the time the minister of the 4th Street Methodist Church in downtown St. Louis. Interestingly enough, Ulysses' parents did not attend the wedding. We're not 100% sure why they chose not to attend the wedding, but there is some speculation that either A, because the 4th Street Church was a Southern Methodist denomination, the Methodist Church split in the 1840s, and the ministers here in St. Louis aligned with the Southern Methodists that were pro-slavery. And then, of course, the Dent family themselves were pro-slavery. Julia's father, Frederick Dent, owns upwards of 30 enslaved African Americans. So there's some speculation that these connections and support of slavery could have been the reason that Ulysses' parents did not attend the wedding. In any case, it was a successful wedding, the beginning of a very long, almost 40-year marriage between Ulysses and Julia. And on a side note, you'll see the picture to the left, that is the Dent City home. Unfortunately, during World War II, the city home was torn down. There had been an effort in the late 1910s going into the 20s and 30s by some local citizens to try to save the Dent City home and turn it into a museum dedicated to the Grant and Dent families. However, the Dent Grant Association never had the funds to be able to save the home, and the city of St. Louis, looking to revitalize downtown St. Louis, is going to tear down this building in 1943 during World War II. So for better or worse, the intersection of 4th and Sear, where the Dent City home was located, is now a parking lot where people can park if they want to go see the St. Louis Cardinals play at Busch Stadium in downtown St. Louis.
Two historic forts, one made of stone, one made of wood.
Now, Ulysses and Julia are going to experience frequent separations even after the Mexican-American War. For a roughly 6-year period from 1848 to 1859, Grant is going to move quite often with the 4th U.S. Infantry to various military posts throughout the country. He will be stationed for a time at Sackett's Harbor in New York, at Fort Wayne in Detroit, Michigan, Fort Vancouver in Washington, in the border of Oregon and Washington, at Fort Humboldt in California, in Eureka, Northern California. Now, Ulysses and Julia, during their time in New York and Michigan, they are able to stay together. And in fact, they have the birth of their first son, Ranger Nick Grant, in 1850. He is born in St. Louis during a brief stay in St. Louis, but Grant was stationed at Fort Wayne at that time. And Julia will be pregnant with their second child, Ulysses Grant Jr., when Ulysses Grant is ordered to go out to Fort Vancouver in Washington Territory. Now, for Julia, she insisted she wanted to go with Ulysses out to Fort Vancouver. However, it was a very dangerous trip. The Grants were at Sackett's Harbor in New York, and their plan of travel was to go down the Atlantic Ocean through the Isthmus of Panama and then eventually make its way out the other side to the Pacific Ocean and eventually land in San Francisco before eventually the troops would make their way to Fort Vancouver. Ulysses insisted that Julia not take this trip, especially since she was pregnant with their second child, Ulysses Jr. That ends up being the right move. There's a terrible cholera outbreak on the ships that the 4th Infantry uses to get to San Francisco, and many of the children that were under the age of 18 will die on this voyage. So it ends up being the right move, and Julia is going to come back to Whitehaven and stay with their parents at Whitehaven as she prepares to give birth to her second son. In any case, from 1852 to 1854, there's a horrible, very troubling, and very difficult separation, again, for Ulysses and Julia. And it's safe to say that for Ulysses, he's going to have bouts of depression during this time. Grant loved Fort Vancouver. He actually looked into moving his family to Fort Vancouver at one point, but did not have the funds to do so. But eventually, when he's stationed at Fort Humboldt in Northern California, Grant finds himself extremely miserable with Army life, with little to do, and in the case of Fort Humboldt, in a very isolated and remote area that was very rainy and very damp, and Grant was just really miserable being away from his family. For example, in 1852, while at Fort Vancouver, Ulysses wrote to Julia and said, quote, "I have nearly filled this sheet, dear Julia, without saying one word about our dear little ones, about whom I think so much. If I could see Fred and hear him talk, and see little Ulysses, I could then be contented for a month, provided their mother was with them. Learn them to be good boys and to think of their pa. If you, Fred, and Ulysses were only here, I would not care to ever go back only to visit our friends. Kiss Fred and Ulysses for their pa, and tell them to kiss their ma for me too." And then in February of 1854, while up at Fort Humboldt in Northern California, Ulysses wrote the following. He said, quote, "You do not know how forsaken I feel here. The place is good enough, but I have interest at others, which I cannot help thinking about day and night. I feel again as if I had been separated from you and Fred long enough, and as to Ulysses, I have never seen him. He must by this time be talking as Fred did when I saw him last. How very much I want to see all of you. Tell me a great deal about him and Fred's pranks with his grandpa." So yes, with Ulysses Grant Jr. having been born in 1852, while Ulysses Sr. is out in the Pacific coast, Ulysses Grant does not see his second son for the first 2 years of his life. Finally, in 1854, Ulysses Grant will offer his resignation to the U.S. Army. He decides the time has come for a change in his life and that he's tired of making a decision between his family and his job.
Historic photo of a 2-story frame house surrounded by a white rail fence.
Now, Ulysses, when he resigns from the army, he decides that he's going to come back to Whitehaven and try his hand at farming. For 5 years, from 1854 to 1859, Ulysses Grant raised a range of fruit and vegetable crops at Whitehaven, including corn, wheat, potatoes, and apples. And during this time, the Grant family added 2 more children to their family. Nellie Grant, the Grant's only daughter, who was born in 1855, and Jesse Grant, the youngest son, who was born in 1858. Now, this period is a period of great struggle for the Grants. There's a multitude of factors that prevent Ulysses Grant from succeeding on the farm. There's a very weak economy in the late 1850s. The country experiences what we might call a recession today that really lowers the value of Grant's crops. St. Louis weather, of course, not always cooperative for farmers, and in Grant's case, there will be unusually cold temperatures for some of the summers that Grant is living here in St. Louis in the late 1850s. And then Grant himself also fought malaria. He had malaria for most of his life, most likely acquired it while growing up in Ohio. And there'll be times when Grant is stuck in bed, too sick to get out and work on the farm. Having said all of that, though, this is a period of great happiness for the Grant family itself. Even though Ulysses struggled on the farm, he got to spend quality time with his 4 children. He got to spend quality time with his wife, reading the newspaper together with Julia, having quality meals together as a family. So even though Grant struggles at Whitehaven, it's not all doom and gloom. This is also a period of great happiness and togetherness as a family for the Grants as well.
A 2-story log cabin surrounded by a grassy lawn.
Another experience for Ulysses here at Whitehaven was building the famous Hardscrabble log cabin. Now, Hardscrabble, the idea behind it is that Grant wants to have his own independence. Now, moving to Whitehaven, this is the very first time the entire Grant family is all living together underneath the same roof. But for better or worse, Grant, by moving to Whitehaven, he's also moving in with his in-laws. Anxious to find that independence that he sought for himself and his family, Grant begins constructing the Hardscrabble log cabin in 1855. The log cabin was originally built about 1.5 miles north of the Whitehaven estate on property that is now a part of St. Paul Churchyard off of Rock Hill Road here in South St. Louis County. It took about a year and a half for Grant to build the log cabin. He did most of the work himself, but there were some neighbors and enslaved laborers nearby, both at Whitehaven and in other properties, who came and assisted with the raising of the house. Hardscrabble, however, ended up being a very short-lived experience. The Grants only lived at Hardscrabble for about 3 months, from October 1856 through the end of the year in 1856. And one reason for that is that Julia Grant, as much as she loved her husband, she hated the Hardscrabble log cabin. So she sort of jokingly referred to the home as Hardscrabble because she just could not stand it. She could never find a way to make it feel like home in the same way that Whitehaven felt like home. And Julia's mother, Ellen, passed away in January of 1857, which also prompted the Grant family to move back to the Whitehaven estate. So the Hardscrabble log cabin still stands today. It's located across the street from us over at Grant's Farm, the famous animal park managed by Anheuser-Busch. You can still see it off of Gravois Road, or if you go to Grant's Farm for a visit. But this is another living symbol of the Grant family and their life here in St. Louis during the 1850s, right before the American Civil War.
A detailed illustration of Ulysses and Julia Grant and their 4 children.
Now, during the American Civil War, once again, Ulysses is going to experience frequent separations from his wife and children as he fights on the battlefield. But there are numerous wonderful stories that highlight the partnership and the marriage between Ulysses and Julia during the Civil War. Julia Grant traveled upwards of 10,000 miles during the American Civil War. She spent a lot of time on the road, and she would often go back and forth between her children and visiting her husband on the battlefield. So there are numerous times where Julia will stay at her husband's headquarters. So, for example, during the Vicksburg campaign through Mississippi, there'll be times when Julia stays with her husband at his headquarters. And then later on, during the Overland campaign of 1864-65, when Grant is fighting General Robert E. Lee in Virginia, there'll be times when she stays with Ulysses at his headquarters, including at City Point, Virginia, south of Richmond, as the siege of Petersburg is going on. So Julia and Ulysses will work together to put their children through school. The four children did attend school during the Civil War. Jesse Grant, the youngest child, spent the least amount of time. He actually spent quite a bit of time with her mother in her travels. But the other three did attend school in various areas, including Galena, Illinois, in Covington, Kentucky, where Ulysses' parents lived. And through the summer of 1863, the grandchildren actually attended school here in St. Louis as well. Interestingly enough, Julia and Ulysses will also work together to secure ownership of the Hardscrabble log cabin. Prior to leaving St. Louis, Ulysses had sold his Hardscrabble log cabin to another farmer named Joseph White. Joseph White defaults on his payments during the American Civil War, and Ulysses will actually help direct Julia. Julia comes to St. Louis. She repurchases the house after the payments had ended, and Julia will take ownership of Hardscrabble in her own name during the American Civil War. So that St. Louis connection for Ulysses and Julia remains. Interestingly enough as well, there's some interesting letters between Ulysses and Julia about the curriculum that their children were studying. And General Grant was pretty vocal about what he wanted his children to study in school. He insisted to Julia that, especially the boys, Fred and Ulysses Jr., learn foreign languages. He wanted them to study German in class. He wanted them to study classic literature as well. But he's equally vocal. He does not want his children to learn music. General Grant hated music. He famously stated that he only knew two songs. One was Yankee Doodle and the other wasn't. So we can see how Ulysses and Julia worked together as parents in the negotiations about the curriculum that their children would study during the American Civil War.
Grant and family pose seated near the porch of a brown and white cottage.
Now, several years after the American Civil War, in 1868, Ulysses Grant was elected as the nation's 18th president. He will take office in 1869, and by all accounts, Ulysses and Julia were wonderful house guests. They took care of the White House. They made renovations to the White House that had been neglected during the American Civil War. Julia is very interested in the politics of Reconstruction. She would often sit with her husband and discuss the pressing political issues. She would talk about the cabinet members on Grant's administration and the work that they were doing. And Julia states in her memoirs that she tried her best to welcome all people to the White House. Now, if we think prior to the American Civil War, we can obviously see here that African Americans are not welcomed into the White House. In fact, African American enslaved laborers built the White House. Julia, even though she had grown up in a strongly pro-slavery household, and there had been 4 enslaved laborers that had been sort of gifted to Julia, who she didn't legally own them, but they did much to attend to her needs in the years before the Civil War. These 4 enslaved people were Dan, Eliza, John, and Julia, also named Julia. But she says in her memoirs that when she assumed the office of First Lady, when her husband became president, that she tried her best to open doors to all people, regardless of race. Julia also introduced a custom of welcoming guests to White House receptions, but using members of the cabinet and wives of the cabinet members and wives of senators to welcome guests to the White House. So Julia, she felt like she didn't want to have to do all of this work on her own, and she wanted to build good relationships across the government. And one way to do this would be to invite the wives of cabinet members and senators to assist with prepping for parties and receptions at the White House. Julia was beloved by the American people. She was a very popular and famous first lady. She did run into one bit of trouble, and that was when she decided to put a fence around the White House. Of course, the White House is the people's house, and back in Grant's day, you would be able to walk through the front doors of the White House, and sometimes you'd even get a chance to shake the president's hand right there in the White House. But Ulysses Grant was at that time the youngest elected president. He was only 46 when he was elected president, and still at that time, his children were fairly young. Particularly Nellie and Jesse Grant, the two youngest children, they're in their early teenage years. They're still kids. So Julia, wanting to sort of shield the children from media attention and to give the kids a chance to have a somewhat normal upbringing, having a chance to go outside and to play with toys and to have space for themselves, she put up a fence around, ordered to have the fence installed around the White House. And while some newspapers were very critical of Julia for doing that, she defended her decision and argued that, hey, we're still raising a family here at the White House. But by all accounts, the Grants had a very enjoyable time at the White House. The one person who was most excited to leave was President Grant himself, remarking in 1877 that he was as excited as a schoolboy to leave the White House after 8 years of bitterly divisive politics during the Reconstruction era.
Grant shaking hands with the Emperor of Japan.
Now, as Ulysses S. Grant leaves the White House in 1877, he decides the time has come for a break, an extended vacation. After all, Grant had served as general during the American Civil War and 8 years as president. It was time for a break. So Ulysses and Julia went on a 2.5-year world tour from 1877 until late 1879. And during this time, Ulysses and Julia got to spend a lot of quality time together as a couple. They visited nations all around the world. There was actually a book published called Around the World with General Grant that was published by John Russell Young, who is a journalist who accompanied the Grants throughout their trip. Julia, in her personal memoirs, about 2/3 of the book is about her travels and about what she saw and what she did during the world tour. It was obviously a significant highlight in her life. We don't have time to examine every single story, but one of my favorite stories was when the Grants were traveling through Switzerland. And they were on a horse and buggy, and they're going up a mountain, and they're getting a view of the Swiss Alps. And Julia decided that she wanted to play a little prank on her husband. And she got out of the buggy, and she left, and she went and hid in the mountains. And so General Grant, he waits for a minute, and then he realizes that his wife is gone, and he starts really getting worried, and he orders the stagecoach to start moving the buggy. Hey, we need to find Julia. She's missing. And then right at the last second, Julia reappeared and scared her husband and had a great laugh about it. And according to Julia, her husband was not too happy about this prank. But for me, it kind of shows the playfulness of Julia. It shows the playfulness of the relationship. And for Ulysses Grant himself, although he's a very quiet and reserved person, Julia is perhaps one of the only, if not the only person that he can really let up his guard and to really share what was on his mind, share his heart with his wife. And just a little moment like that during the world tour just really shows the dynamic of their marriage. I would say that ultimately everybody deserves a relationship, deserves a marriage that was as successful, as positive, and as kind as the marriage between Ulysses and Julia Grant.
And older Ulysses and Julia Grant seated on a porch surrounded by their children and grandchildren.
After the world tour, Ulysses and Julia relocated to New York City. and they will live in New York City for the remainder of Ulysses S. Grant's life. Now, Ulysses, he is going to run into serious issues in 1884, leading up to his eventual death in 1885. One of the issues is that Grant gets involved with a Wall Street investment banking firm, and his partner in the firm, Ferdinand Ward, is basically a 19th century version of Bernie Madoff. He is cooking the books the whole time. The Grant family loses their entire fortune in this Wall Street market swindle. And General Grant was also a very heavy smoker, known to smoke up to 20 cigars a day. And he will be diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer. So for the last 6 weeks of General Grant's life, the family relocated up to a cottage in upstate New York in an area called Mount McGregor. And during this time, it's a very painful time as Julia is doing whatever she can to care for her husband, knowing that he doesn't have much time to live. I particularly love the picture that we can see in this PowerPoint. This is a gathering of much of the family shortly before Grant passes away in 1885. We can see 3 of the 4 Grant children. To the far left, sitting down, is Ulysses S. Grant Jr., the second son. Fred Grant, the oldest son, is pictured standing behind his father. Jesse Grant, the youngest son, is over in the corner to the right. Several of the sons and their wives are pictured here. And down at the very front is Ulysses S. Grant III. He will later also attend West Point and become a general who serves in World War I and World War II as well. But in any case, Grant, towards the very end of his life, about a month before he died, he wrote a note to Julia. He left it in his coat pocket to be read by Julia after his eventual passing on July 23rd of 1885. And here was Ulysses' final words to his wife, Julia. He said, quote, "My dear wife, there are some matters about which I would like to talk about, but which I cannot. The subject of death would be painful to you and the children, and by reflex, painful to me also. When I see you and them depressed, I join the feeling. I have known for a long time that my end was approaching with certainty. How far away I could not venture to guess. I had an idea, however, that I would live until fall 1885 or the early part of winter 1886. I see now, however, that the time is approaching much more rapidly. I am constantly losing flesh and strength. Under these circumstances, the end is not far off. Look after our dear children and direct them in the paths of rectitude. With these few injunctions and the knowledge I have of your love and affections, and of the dutiful affections of all our children, I bid you a final farewell until we meet in another, and I trust, better world."
An imposing neoclassical building with large columns and a dome. Mature trees flank both sides.
When Ulysses S. Grant dies in July of 1885, there are questions about his final resting place. Prior to his death, Ulysses himself had never stated a preference one way or the other on where he wanted to be buried. He suggested possibly being buried at West Point, but at that time, the wives of soldiers were not allowed to be buried next to their husbands. There had also been some loose talk of the Grants being buried here in St. Louis. As a matter of fact, during Grant's presidency, the Grants actually did put a down payment on a plot of land in Bellefontaine Cemetery in North St. Louis. For reasons unknown, this plan fell through, but in any case, New York City emerges as the final resting place for Grant for a number of reasons. One is that the city of New York offered a plot of land for a burial site in an area called Riverside Park in the northern part of New York City. Secondly, Julia Grant wants to stay close to her husband. She plans to stay in New York City, and she would like to be close to the tomb. So a temporary tomb was erected at Riverside Park. And for 12 years, from 1885 until 1897, there's a major fundraising effort and initiative to raise funds from citizens in the United States and other parts of the world to raise the funds to create a mausoleum. And on the anniversary of Ulysses S. Grant's birth, on April 27th, 1897, there was a lavish ceremony and a dedication of the new tomb for Ulysses S. Grant. His remains were removed to this mausoleum, and this mausoleum today is managed by the National Park Service, and it is the largest mausoleum in the United States still to this day. The only wish that Ulysses had expressed before his death was that Julia be by his side. And when Julia Grant died 5 years after the dedication ceremony in 1902, she likewise was taken to this tomb. So Ulysses and Julia Grant are resting together at General Grant National Memorial, what a lot of us call shorthand Grant's Tomb in New York City. So Ulysses and Julia, a loving, wonderful relationship during their lifetimes, a marriage of 37 years, still resting side by side today in New York City. So thank you so much for watching this presentation. I hope you learned some new things and some new insights about the relationship between Ulysses and Julia Grant. And once again, here in St. Louis at U.S. Grant National Historic Site, we are open daily from 9 to 5 and offering tours of Ulysses S. Grant's Whitehaven estate. Thanks for watching.